Age of Wonders 4's had a pretty interesting launch. A couple of fast and efficient patches at the start. The team, of course, tweeting that it was the fastest selling game in the franchise's history. This was despite quite a bit, or at least a little bit of controversy around crashes and stability, but with a fairly bright future, it would seem, ahead for Age of Wonders 4. In this video, I wanted to reflect on all of that, and on how the game stands now that the dust has settled. With our YouTube housekeeping out of the way, let's jump straight in. And we'll start by taking a look at the reviewers' scores, which came in generally at around an 8 or a 9 out of 10, the Metascore score at the moment being 83. And my review, indeed a slightly early access look at the game, was roughly the same. I think it could very well be a contender for Strategy Game of the Year. Despite this though, as you've seen in the introduction and probably on the internet, the launch wasn't the smoothest possible launch. In fact, when I woke up on launch day, Steam reviews were sitting at around 63%, so quite mixed. And there were plenty of complaints from people with, granted, not a lot of playing time, but issues around the game crashing, around specific things in the game too. No campaign, for example, was one that we just saw there. There's certainly a long list of complaints, but the real crucial one at the start was around the performance. Actually, the game just will not run on my fairly high-end, right, 3080 Ti plus fairly new system, as we can see here from this Reddit post, just unable to play it without it crashing. And of course, as this played out, we realized that there was a hotfix version that seemed to work a little bit better. And that seemed to be a general fix for those issues. I'm going to return to those in a little bit, because I think it's also important to note that those issues were somewhat of a minority. And actually, the majority of the result, the majority of the response, was generally something kind of like this. Fastest selling game in the series' history. Granted, Age of Wonders 3 is 10 years old, and Planetfall may not have been to everyone's taste 3 or 4 years ago, but this is still a really significant achievement. 250,000 copies sold in 1 week is not bad at all for an Age of Wonders game, and I think the sales reflect a level of interest. The question is, can that level of interest be adequately supported as the game moves forward? Is that interest satisfied as well with the product that they've got? Well, we can lean into this a little bit. You see, they also tweeted about player count numbers, and we can see that too. Now, granted, it's very early days, right? At the time of recording, Age of Wonders 4 has been out in the little grubby hands of us and the general public for about 2 weeks. And as you can see, of course, the player count has declined a little bit from highs of 43,000 down to yesterday's peak of about 26. It does appear to be stabilizing a little bit, but it's actually too early to start to read into these numbers. We need to wait for a little bit more of the dust to settle. I would note, though, in the last couple of days, it did seem to be stabilizing a little, so we'll have to monitor that moving forward. For a game like Age of Wonders 4, though, those are some fairly impressive player count numbers, and it's managed to hold on to plenty of players. Part of that was, of course, thanks to this fix update. This was released, I think, 2 days after the game came out. No gameplay changes, substantive, right? You're not getting new systems, you're not getting your warfare overhauled, or whatever it may be on your wish list. But what we did see was the NVIDIA GeForce GPUs, the 30 series fix, meaning that the game should now not crash all the time, and loads of other general fixes too. I'm not going to go into the detail of those here, just trust me, there was a lot of bug fixes. And of course that crucial one was around making sure that the game actually performs better, it actually runs well on a variety of systems, it's important to note, and it seems to have done that. Flash forward around a week, and there's another PC hotfix. Sorry, console players, I can't get player count information for you, nor have you quite received the level of attention that PC has. Here again, it was just a huge amount of fixes, bug fixes, crashes, exploits, modding-related issues. You name it, they've got it. Let's talk. Again, I don't really need to go into the detail for those patch notes because it's fairly self-explanatory. They're getting the launch issues, right? This is the post-launch patch, and it seems to have worked really well. My game was crashing a little bit when I moved from the reviewer build onto the public build, the release build. But a couple of days later, and with that hotfix version that we were able to use before that even officially rolled the patch out on Steam, it fixed all of those problems. And I've heard many other people reflect similarly. Let me know below, by the way. Did you crash at the start and now you're not? Are you still crashing? Open your eyes. I'm not sure what your situation will be like, but generally speaking, it seems to have improved significantly. It does bring us to another talking point, and that's more broadly around the game itself. Okay, so they've got these patch updates. Fantastic, right? They've got lots of player counts. Good for you, Jumbo. But what about the actual game? Well, I think that Age of Wonders 4 has generally lived up to its expectations. It tends to promote itself as a 4X strategy game, as you would expect, turn-based, of course, and one that's focused a lot around customization. A customization inside of course, quite a rich fantasy setting. The other thing, perhaps lesser promoted by the game, but important to keep in mind when you have a 4X strategy game that has a lot of customization, there's also going to be a really strong sort of fundamental element of replayability here as well. Of me not just playing this once for 5 minutes and then getting bored and wanting to go and kick a ball around outside or whatever 90s kids do, but instead, actually, there's a really significant amount of replayability, not just in the story, but in the game itself. What do I think about these things? I think that generally it's lived up to these expectations. Age of Wonders 4 delivers a very interesting 4X strategy game experience where there is so much depth and detail. Take the Tomes of Magic, for example, right? 9 tomes, each one has 3, 4, 5, 6 different spells, and unlocks, unit enchantments, or unit unlocks, city spells, you name it. And that's just one layer of the game. Just one small part of that customization feeding in. Now, there have been some criticisms of these elements as well, and I think it's fair to mention them, even if they are a little bit outnumbered. I mentioned earlier that on release day, Steam reviews were sitting at around 63%. They've since lifted themselves up nicely to around 83%, putting it at a similar ballpark to something like Crusader Kings or Stellaris, which tend to sit around the mid-80s for their Steam user reviews, depending on the latest DLC release and how people are feeling at the time. It's also important to note that things can get review bombed when they come out, but review bombers tend to lose interest after, a couple of hours, potentially maybe a few days. And once that's moved along, we tend to get a better look at how, again, to repeat myself, about how that dust has settled. I think that the customization does bring a few challenges, a few drawbacks. Some people have said, I don't want to be able to change all the traits on every race. I want certain races to have distinct features that actually make them distinct from another. The counter side to this is, well, if you want us to put those rules in, for example, rat races can only have quick reflexes, or orcs have the hearty trait. I mean, that's all fine and good, and it would potentially make a more slightly sort of lore-rich or story-rich world, but the trade-off for that is then you have a whole load of people saying, I want to have orcs with quick reflexes. Why are you ring-fencing me in like this? And so I think, on balance, they've done a very good job. I mean, even the hero skills, for example, a very rich and detailed tree with lots to work on. Speaking of lots to work on, Age of Wonders 4 has a lot of content on the way. I have a separate video about the DLC, so I'm not going to talk about it at great length here. You're welcome to go and check that out. But the fundamental thing that you need to know, if you missed it, is that there are 4 DLC packs releasing. Dragon Dawn, Empires and Ashes, Primal Fury, and Eldritch Realms. And they're releasing starting in Q3 of this year, so just potentially a month or two away, and then one each quarter as we move through until around this time next year. The DLC packs, the information on them is fairly light, but they have revealed a few things, like these screenshots, which I'll show you on screen now. We know that we're going to have dragons as rulers and lizard people as a race to play, and as you can see, to support them in their great fight. We also know that we'll be receiving a variety of in-game features, including, of course, as you can imagine, lots of different tomes of magic, customization features. What we don't know so much about is whether there will be a lot of accompanying new gameplay systems to go along with this, new features, etc. We do know, however, that there will be more lore and more story brought in, not just potentially in terms of new realms and story realms, but also the things that inhabit the world, the living creatures, right? The giant fauna that's infesting some goodies on the map, or the marauding, roaming armies, the wonders potentially, the map events, city-state dealings, and more. I'll be sure to cover the full detail once we have it, but the TLDR at the moment is there are going to be 4 DLC packs priced between $10 and $20 each, unless you want to get the expansion pass, in which case you can bundle it all together. And we'll be getting one roughly every 3 months. An exciting future for Age of Wonders 4. And I think it's really important that this future is accompanied by the kinds of things that we've already had a little bit of a taste of. So the game's received, as we talked about earlier, 2 patch updates on Steam. None of them, of course, rolling out new gameplay features, but very focused on the specific issues that were impacting players, and as I've mentioned, to my knowledge, they've been quite successful in both rolling those out quickly and fixing the problem. I'd expect to see that moving forward. From what I've heard about Triumph, and of course this game is a Paradox game too, which is a whole nother conversation, a whole nother can of worms to open up. But I've heard that Triumph are very good at supporting their games, and the early evidence seems to suggest, yes, that is absolutely true. On the Paradox front, of course, if you're a regular 4X gamer, viewer of this channel, grand strategy gamer, you'll know that Paradox games that are published by Paradox don't always have the cleanest launch record. People will often joke about the games launching in sort of a beta state, and everybody's playtesting it as they roll out patches and significant DLC packs over the game's sort of 1, 2, 3 year release. Plus. Here's looking at you, Stellaris. Here's looking at you, Hearts of Iron 4. Potentially Victoria 3 is an example of that, but it's too early to call that one just yet. I would note that while all of this may very well be true, it's important to remember that those games are slightly different in their structure. This is a 4X turn-based strategy game, not a grand strategy game. And I think that matters a lot. Not just for players potentially like you and I who have played quite a bit, or maybe you're new to Age of Wonders 4, thinking about buying it and wanting to listen to this video to try and get a better perspective of whether you should and how it fits. And it's an important point to note that it fits in a slightly different world from those ones. This game is slightly more simple, slightly easier to understand. It isn't at its core a really complex grand strategy game, something like EU4, CK3. It's slightly more like Civ, right? This is a 4X strategy game. It's like Civilization. It's like Humankind. It works incredibly well, and the base system is brilliant. So with all of this, granted, slightly complex, lot of information that we've covered today, how does it all fit together? Well, I think that Age of Wonders 4 suffered from a slightly shaky, wonky launch. Reviews were mixed. If you looked at it on release day, you might have clicked into it and thought, ooh, I don't know if I want to go near this, Mixed reviews, 60-something%. No, I'll keep my dollars in my wallet. And that would have been fair enough. As we moved through, we saw some fairly quick patches come out, address a lot of those crashing issues. We also saw, it's important to note, haven't talked about it much yet, a successful day one launch on console as well as PC. There are strategy games that have worked for years to try and get their game to run on console, right? There are plenty of examples. I think that Civilization 6 took a long time to work its way out, and DLC still struggles. Humankind promised a console version that has, up until this point, not materialized in any way. Potentially, this isn't the easiest thing to do. I'm not an expert on that. I'm just looking at the examples, some similar examples that I've seen recently. Of course, there are lots of things that will feed into it, but credit to them, they seem to have pulled that off, and from the console players that I've talked to, the game runs pretty well on PlayStation 5, on the new Xbox. I've tried it out a little bit with controller, and I think that the controller support's really great too. So then, has the game moved through into a point where it's now got a solid base and it's ready to move? I think so. I think that those shaky periods, particularly on PC for the first few days, have been ironed out. I think that the game has presented a pretty clear plan moving forward too, as we've discussed. 4 DLC packs rolling out in an expansion pass covering the next 12 months of Age of Wonders 4, promising at least a year's worth of supported content. And of course, anybody who's familiar with how these games get updated will know that there tend to be free updates that go either alongside the paid updates or maybe flow out in between. some fixing games, some adding new features. I think it'll be really interesting to see how Age of Wonders 4 interest, community, player count is upheld. We know that it has other features too, like multiplayer, and potentially huge modding potential. So Age of Wonders 4, I believe, has a bright future ahead of it, and I hope to be proven right over the next 12 months, looking at what we've talked about today. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'll see each and every one of you next time. Take care, everybody.